Well, thank you, Mark. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed the research that goes into preparing for these talks, and because you've come to hear about it, I have an excuse for all of that study, and I get to share. So let's dive right in. Most of my research is usually from Henry Laurency, and the quotes, most of them in the handout are from Laurency. I encourage you to read Laurency for yourself. I considered it a wonderful discovery when I realized that he was summarizing in a way that I could understand so many of the esoteric, the theosophical teachings over the years. And for this talk, I've also referred to quite a number of books here from various theosophical authors that I really enjoyed reading for this talk. I encourage you to investigate them for yourself. You can probably buy them in the bookstore. I'll be talking about each of the authors that I mentioned here and what the books are about. It all comes down to consciousness, of course. It always does. And so we're going to be talking about a very different kind of consciousness, that of this kingdom of the Devas. But let's take a moment to be aware of our own consciousness. Just a moment to take note of the fact that we are conscious. That is happening right now. We're being aware. It comes from somewhere in us. If we can actually touch that source of consciousness itself within us, we've really found something incredible. And it's worth a second just to get in touch with it and realize to be conscious of consciousness. It's a very special thing. Actually a special thing for the human kingdom. That's one thing we're all about, is becoming self-aware. Well, we're going to talk about the kingdom of the Devas. It has many names, and that's one of the things I've discovered from reading, is that there's no particular agreement on the names for the various inhabitants of this kingdom, and even for the worlds that they live in. So I'll be trying to explain as we go what I mean by various terms. But one thing that we're going to have to start with is the idea of subtle worlds. That there are around us, interpenetrating this dense physical world, other worlds really of subtler material, of higher vibrational frequency material that flows right through everything. And it's, when you think about it in terms of what we are, it becomes not so much of a stretch. We are not just these very dense physical bodies, even though science may not be ready to agree with that yet, but there's what some who have objective vision can tell us is an energy body that animates the dense physical, that in this talk I'll be calling the etheric body. The subtler frequencies, the notes in the octave of the physical is what we're talking about when we talk about etheric. The higher notes in that octave that science is now just discovering with its subatomic research. It's touching the densest of the ethers, as they're known. And that is where we will, even through science, encounter the Devas and be able to actually photograph, record them, communicate with them. That's predicted to be coming up for humanity relatively soon. But before we get there, there are many people, great theosophists and people that have spoken here, like David Spangler, who has very good research into these beings and these worlds. They have the opened abilities to detect those, that kind of material. And when you have so many great teachers coming from such a lovely place too, when they talk about the Devas, and you put it all together and you realize there's a lot going on, so much more going on than we're aware of, as in all of these esoteric topics. But when you talk about the Devas, it's amazing how close they are to us at all times, and us being unaware of them. This dense etheric world is accessible through, there are Indian yoga techniques that will open up etheric objective vision. That's what we're talking about. There are exercises that you can do in purifying your field and raising your vibration. We'll talk a little bit about it. If people are interested in coming into contact with the Devas, there are things that you can do that have been advocated by those who already managed to do it. But it's going to be a big assumption here. We're talking about worlds interpenetrating, surrounding, certainly part of us already. The energy body that we have is etheric, and it's etheric energy that flows through our physical and animates it. And when I mention the physical octave, well, there are other octaves. The next octave would be called the emotional or astral world, plane, octave. It gets lots of names, but it also interpenetrates us, and we have emotional bodies. We have astral bodies. That's how we experience emotion. We experience it subjectively. When we get objective sense opened up, it'll be objective and is present to us as anything that we see in the dense physical world. That's inevitable for all of us, according to esoterics. In the next octave is the mental. We have mental bodies. When we think, we're manipulating mental material. So you think of a giraffe right now, you've assembled some mental material of the mental plane into the form of a little giraffe, and all of us have got little giraffes floating around us that could be objectively seen by someone who has mental clairvoyance, who could actually has objective awareness of the substance of the mental world. Those little giraffes don't last very long because we don't think about them very hard. But we'll talk more about the structures that we make by thinking about things too. So there was a question raised when Enrico Fermi, the great scientist in the atomic age, helped introduce, the atomic bomb, among other things. But he asked a famous question that's become known as Fermi's paradox. That was, if there are all these other planets and billions of possible places for life to evolve and potentially other humanities, where is everybody? And that's a good question. It is a paradox. Why don't we know more about that? Why don't we know more about the Devas? Well, let me just give you some of the reasons. First of all, we are very dense. Our material, that is. And really, humanity as a whole, I have to say, more than just the material. We're not really ready for such a big idea about these subtle planes until science and the newspapers and the internet can assure us that it's true. But it's especially unusual for life to take on as dense a form as we take. That's why we seem to be somewhat alone. The Devas, their bodies are not made out of cellular material like ours. That's peculiar to our very dense physical form. They have electromagnetically held together bodies, and that's part of these etheric planes of the physical. There's an electrical nature to them. All of our subtler bodies, whether etheric, emotional, mental, are also held together the same way and can simply reassemble. There's nothing that you can't lose a limb in an emotional body. It's only in this very dense physical world where we need this dense structure for particular reasons. And the reason proposed in esoterics is that through them we learn compassion because they're so suitable for suffering. But the suffering of ourselves and others is how we learn compassion. This planet has been dedicated to that particular cause. Most of us are here, apparently, according to this, because we needed to learn more about compassion. And this is the world we're learning it in. That's that reason, this dense material form. I mean, that's one reason we're not so aware of the inhabitants of the subtler worlds. We're very focused on this dense form, and it's like the input from our dense senses shouts out everything else. It takes a lot of very, very highly tuned awareness to tune in on subtler things than what is so in our face about our physical existence. And what scientist or journalist is really going to go out on a limb here and talk about the angels without being afraid of sounding woo-woo or whatever? That's one reason we don't know. There aren't enough of them willing to take that chance. And there are plenty of people very scared of how big an idea that is. This idea that there are so many other beings than us, all in their own evolutionary path, all interacting with us in ways that we don't even know about. That's a pretty scary idea. It could really upset a lot of people's conceptions of reality. I mean, religion has made some very hard to interpret attempts to talk about these kingdoms with the angels and the archangels and things like that, but that doesn't tell us much. It's our goal, humanity's goal, is to get to a place in consciousness that the Devas are already at. That's another reason we don't relate to them very easily. They have never been in this tough spot that humans are in, where we're isolated and feel lonely and unable to be sure we're understood and struggle to even recognize that there's unity among all of us. The Devas never have had that experience. They've always known and know at all times that they're part of this unity, that love is ruling everything, that all is for the good, that wonderfully advanced divine beings are guiding things. This is already known to them. They work within that framework. That's very foreign to us. So tuning in on that kind of consciousness is a little difficult for us. They certainly don't fall into the traps that we do with selfishness or greed. Yet, unfortunately, if we were to interact with them, we might bring those same bad qualities to the table with them. And it has apparently happened before. In humanity as a whole has, just like individuals have their incarnations, humanity as a whole has its incarnations. The previous was Atlantis for us, Atlantean times. And in those human beings had the ability to see the subtle worlds, to work with the Devas. And unfortunately, by the end of their period, they had abused that relationship. They had used Devas and elemental forces to wage war on each other, to basically for the purposes of black magic. And when that civilization got to the point where no one could advance at all, incarnating into it, it was so corrupted and so full of, well, the bad results of misusing the knowledge had to be withdrawn. And that was a part of the destruction of Atlantis, to lose that knowledge. And part of the knowledge was the knowledge of the Devas and all the angels. And so we've had to do without that, just like we've had to do without the spiritual leadership of the planet ever since the sinking of Atlantis, because we lost the privilege of knowing about it by rejecting it back then. So that's another reason the Devas are a bit difficult. Their leadership is even trying to slow down, in some cases, our ability to work with the Devas, because they're afraid of that kind of thing happening again. They'd really prefer if our relationship with the Devas was based on our progress to an unselfish mode of being, more unselfish at least, further along than we are. Of course, there are plenty of individuals who've got the kind of ability to contact them and have the purity of heart to never abuse a relationship like that. And that's why we know what we know, because those individuals are giving us information. I mentioned that they're perfectly comfortable with their leadership. The Devas work in an absolutely wonderfully organized hierarchy, and every one of them loves and respects the greater Deva, the archangel, whatever it might be called, that is guiding their work in this world. Pretty foreign to us. We're apparently unable to choose leaders effectively, and certainly don't feel like following the ones we've chosen. Subject of my next talk. Those who have this ability are brave to have shared it, because they could have been judged heavily by the more materialistically minded scientists and psychiatrists of the times, and been locked up. And now, instead of locking you up, they would give you enough powerful drugs to make sure you never saw a Deva again. If you went to the psychiatrist and said you were seeing these, they'd say, well, take a bunch of these and you won't see them anymore. And it's I'm taking a risk right now, even talking about them, trying to be a person functioning in the conventional world. We'll see how it works out. But I can really understand the people that have the knowledge and hesitate to speak up about it. Thank goodness for people like David Spangler and Dora Van Gelder and others. And yet another reason that it can be difficult for these our awareness to be commonplace is that the people who can communicate are the ones who aren't selfish and aren't after worldly power, that are basically rather different than the average person. And it's hard for the conventional people presenting their opinions on the internet or whatever to actually acknowledge and not be a little wary of somebody who's so different in their purity, So that's another reason. The Devas themselves have a hard time with humans in general because we destroy natural beauty left and right. They are not very happy about it. That's what they're all about. They really support and love and revel and take great joy in natural beauty, something that we need to learn a lot more how to do. We could be learning it from them. Instead, we're building resorts on top of their favorite spots. So they tend to avoid us, and it's a sacrifice for any higher being to spend time in the general human atmosphere of, where people are basically walking storm clouds of irritation and anger and ignorance. Sorry, I'm human, so I guess I can criticize humans. We're not all that ready for communication with beings who are coming from a very pure, loving, beautiful place. There's not a lot of material in the esoteric books about extraterrestrials, but it's likely the same kind of thing. They don't come down to the same dense level of form as we have. They don't come lower than the higher etheric that we're not aware of. So it's basically the answer to Fermi's paradox. If we see people like us, that's probably not a good thing. If there are humans with dense form contacting us, that's maybe something we should watch out for. Think of the movie Avatar, if you've seen that. It's a good example of humans with the bad attitude causing problems for a very well-organized ecosystem. Imagine an island in the Pacific that with purely undisturbed people that have worked it all out for themselves. Well, the first boat that comes by hopefully is not business people or military or tourists, or the best they can hope for is a boat full of anthropologists. But even that is going to change them permanently. So the best kind of boat they can hope for is people so wise they know to leave well enough alone. And where are those people in our conventional institutions? I don't think we have any of those out there yet. So it's a dangerous thing for the Devic world to be known to those humans who have all their reasons to mess with the Devic world. But as I mentioned, we've got some great Theosophists. Geoffrey Hodson, his books are here. Charles Leadbeater, Dora Van Gelder, Dorothy McLean, David Spangler. Daphne Charters, maybe a lot of you might not have heard of, but she tells great stories coming from the perspective of the Devas themselves. Her book, 40 Years with the Devas, I've recently come across. Just the fairies. She works particularly with the garden fairies and, not the great majestic Devic beings that you read about in some of the other books, but the little ones. And then she'll get together with them, hear their stories. It's a lot of fun. R.J. Stewart is out there, living person with many, many stories of all different kinds. Other humans interact in different ways over time, like Debussy's music often evokes the Devic worlds, the beauty of a meadow, prelude to the afternoon of a fawn, being in nature. I'm sure I would like to actually, if I ever get enough contact with the nature spirits, I'll be saying, did you like that music? What did you think of that? And I can play it for them. Shakespeare, in his play The Tempest, Dora Van Gelder wrote about this. The characterization of Ariel as being bound to his master by mingled respect and love, his spirit of mischief, he's talking about a Deva in the play, of his quick and adroit actions backed by the power of Prospero, his tolerant attitude toward all beings, his control of the lumpish Caliban, his command of the elements, all this shows the knowledge of the poet, Shakespeare, to be as sound here as in those fields where his knowledge is accepted as sure. Well, Shakespeare is quite a special individual. A lot of theories about how far beyond the average human he really was. And of course, every culture has got its traditions of the little people or the ones that or the leprechauns, and especially we hear about it from England, all over Europe, and every culture has got stories of them with all these different names: fairies and elves and pixies and gnomes and leprechauns and sylphs and genies and jinn and on and on. It's many different forms. And one problem with the forms of beings that don't have these dense, very hard to change physical bodies is they're very changeable. An electromagnetic body like that, these beings can appear as they wish, and really in their simplest form, to see them is to basically see an energy vortex that's radiating out particular kinds of energy. They can present a particular form, and they will, especially if it's for us, because we tend to relate to them better that way. And they'll present sometimes a form wearing clothes from the 1700s, because they really liked those shoes with the toes that curled up and around that people wore back then. They have a lot of fun with humans on their side, and actually, we are a source of a great deal of jests on their part. Sometimes even pranks on us. So we project our own thoughts about what these creatures are into their world and into how we perceive them. That makes it pretty hard to be objective sometimes. We read a lot of stories about them eating. Well, they don't need to eat. That's only these kind of bodies that need food. They live on the energy that flows through them, the energy they give out. We have stories about them having wings, but they don't need them. They can simply go to where they want to go. They don't need them to fly. They may like to have them. They certainly look lovely. And all of these authors have a hard time describing them because, someone says, what does a fairy look like? It's like saying, what does a bird look like? Well, you can talk about it. It's got a beak, it's got wings, it's got feet, but there's an ostrich and a parakeet, and it turns out that in the Devic world, there are even more varieties of beings than there are animal types in the world we're familiar with. So it is, eventually scientists will be observing. Science will get there. You can't wait 500 years. If you can't wait 500 years, you need to read these books and learn more about them through other people's experience. But eventually science will catalog all the little colored devas and pixies and fairies and everything of all the different worlds. They'll be quite objectively observable. But we're not there yet. Color is a very important aspect to the devas. Color and sound, apparently, from the books. Just to read some of the examples of what people have seen looking at particular fairies that like to live in particular regions of the planet. In California, white and gold fairies are very common. Emerald green in England and the US Northeast. Sky blue in Australia. And Java has indigo devas with streaks of gold, of silver through them, and also devas that are all shades of yellow. Many different shades of yellow, all in one being. And there are varieties that are striped with red, yellow, or green, yellow, and green and white. They seem to really enjoy colors. South Sea Islands, there are mother of pearl fairies that just glisten like opals with all different colors. The sound, the music, people talk about the lovely music that no one could ever write, that the devas and the angels produce or live in. Maybe I'm not really sure if it's a matter of the atmosphere they're in, but it's actually the easiest thing for me to tune in on. Like a particular tree I know of that I know that they're there, and if I tune on them, it's like a kind of music just beyond what I can hear. That's the impression that I get that lets me know that they're there. And it feels good to hear that. There's joy in it. And of course it would be, coming from the Devas in their world of love and unity. I've had a few other experiences, and I expect I needed to, because being a scientific type, if I didn't have any experiences, I'd have a really hard time with all of this. And I suppose other scientific types I'm talking to are probably having a hard time with a lot of it. But I'm not really as tuned in. I have to be very practical functioning in this world these days. But back in my early 20s, I lived up behind Santa Cruz in the mountains in the redwood forest, and I had a little more time. And I remember one time tuning in an evening, a stand of redwood trees across from my deck. I just really got still enough so that no thoughts were interfering, and was able to listen. And I think discovered yet another reason why it's hard for us to tune in on them. These redwood trees, they're not mammals. You know, they're not warm and fuzzy. They're drinking the cold water of the earth and passing it through on a very different sense of the time passing. They were serious, and to someone who is prone to being scared of the unknown, it could even be scary that they were so not like any other consciousness we're familiar with. You know, they're not bunnies. They're not cuddly. So, when I was living at this time, I had every morning I would start the day walking in the woods, walking down to the creek, and I wouldn't come back to the house until I quit thinking about everything. Until I quit thinking about, okay, I got a mortgage payment coming up in 10 days, and you know, that's how the walk would start. And by the time I could come home, I would have had to let go of all of that and simply be present. I wish I had more time for that these days. That was a wonderful exercise. But I would get there eventually and be happy when I got there, because I was suddenly present in a very beautiful place with no worries, because I wasn't going to pay any attention to any worries, and everything was lovely. And that's when I first sensed other intelligence, the idea of being watched, you know, that sense. Scientists actually call it another sense that every being has. We're all aware if we're being watched. We had to learn that or be eaten at some point in our evolution through the kingdoms. So I felt, okay, I'm observed here. And since I was happy anyway, I would start whistling and singing like I like to do. Just ask my wife. And sometimes I'd dance along the trail. I was in a good mood. And they loved that. I could tell they did. I could feel a response from these beings out there that this made them feel, and maybe I was actually just tuning in on their energy and letting it affect me. That's the more likely explanation, that once I finally got clear enough to listen, I was sharing some of the joy with them. And I felt very special to them, like they cared about me, they were enjoying my presence. That was fun. But being a human being, I had to do some experiments. And one of the experiments was to say, well, little beings that are watching me, they're here, can you lead me to any treasure? You know, isn't that what they're supposed to do according to the books? They can lead you to treasure. So I was listening well enough to actually get guided to some degree. And I'd walk up to a trail, and I'd get a sense of, go this way, okay, go that way, go up here, go up behind these houses up here. And I must have been tuned in pretty well, because at one point they said, go right into that thicket. I said, really? Okay, all right. I went right into the thicket, and I did find a treasure there. But it may have been a treasure to a 14-year-old boy, because it was a very weathered Playboy magazine. So maybe if you're asking to be led to treasure, you did be more specific. So for all the Devas knew, that was a great treasure. So I do think that what I learned was that love and this feeling of joy, if you want to work with them, focus on that, and it will resonate with them and be strengthened from even the attempt to talk to them and work with them. So let's take a step back and look at human evolution and the Devic evolution. It's a parallel evolution going on side by side with human at all times. I think I mentioned that there are 200 billion individuals in that kingdom, 60 billion in ours. At this time, only 7 billion of the 60 billion human souls are in incarnation. Most of the rest, it turns out, are actually waiting for the incarnated ones to advance enough so that they can come down. I mean, they're more advanced than the incarnated ones and are waiting for more advanced conditions for them to incarnate. But the Devas cycle in and out. They're advancing too. They're trying to achieve their evolutionary path, which is somewhat unlike ours in that they are trying to work with matter. There's matter, motion, consciousness. That's the great trinity behind everything, according to Laurency, who says it's really what Pythagoras taught long, long ago. Matter, motion, consciousness. And the Devas are particularly focused on the matter aspect. They're often called the builders. They work with material, with vibration. They actually are involved in building our bodies and building out plant forms and all of those things. Humans, though we're not as far along in our kingdom as the Devas are in theirs, are working with the consciousness aspect. We're creators. We actually, in proper relationship with the Devic kingdom, they are creating the things that we're thinking up that we want to have or create in this world. We're like miniature gods is the way that it's put. And we're in training to be gods that are actually creating worlds and creating much larger scope. And we'll be doing that hand in hand with the help of the builders, the Devas. So they are very involved and caring and concerned and working with this material. As they evolve, they start out very small, little focal points of energy with small capacity. And gradually, as they evolve, they get bigger. They have more and more energy capacity, more transmission through them, more intelligent use of that energy. And the smaller ones end up working in a hierarchy with the larger ones supervising. The great archangel type Devas, when they if we are to see them at all, take immense forms, somewhat like human, but are drawn by some of the, I don't think we have any of the artwork up here, but some of these authors have actually created pictures of like a giant sea Deva that stands 50 meters tall and beautiful flows of energy through it. So that's a bit different. We're busily creating out of our dissatisfaction, but that's part of our learning to be God's role. We use the will aspect, and it's difficult. Human kingdom is one of the hardest ones to make progress in. They actually will help us a lot more, and that's something else I'll talk about if we give them the opportunity. But to them, another thing is different. To them, life is play, especially little ones. They're just having a great time doing what they want. They love the plants they're helping. The fairies work with the plant, and if they see the plant is having a problem in some area, they'll just bring energy into it with all this love. They'll guide the plant intelligence. For instance, the tree has its own intelligent consciousness that's evolving. It is doing great to make it the vegetable kingdom from the mineral. It's eventually trying to make it to the animal kingdom, to the human. That's the progress through the various kingdoms. And we've all been through that, according to esoterics. We've made our way through the mineral, a passive consciousness. This science of hylozoics is what Pythagoras brought, says that there's consciousness in everything. And this consciousness is latent, just waking up in the mineral kingdom. In the plant kingdom, it's purely subjective, just aware of its own body and nothing else. Kind of like we are with our emotional and mental bodies. We're just subjectively aware there. We're not objectively aware of those worlds yet. Plants aren't objectively aware of the physical world yet. They're just aware of their own bodies. And then they make the jump to the animal kingdom with self-awareness that's objective of moving around and all of that. To get to the human kingdom, self-consciousness. Going back to the thing I was talking about at the beginning, being aware of our consciousness, of our identity, that's what makes the jump to human. The Devas are doing something rather similar, but what they do is they still have free will. They're evolutionary beings. All beings that are evolving through their choices. If their choices were made for them, they wouldn't learn a thing. We all learn through our choices. So they are making the best choices they can, yet they're absolutely devoted to serving this good cause and good purpose and plan that they understand. They want to help their plants, or they want to supervise this entire volcanic eruption. They're involved in all of those kind of natural phenomena. So they do it for a different reason than we do. They do it because they just already know that they're part of everything. They want to be of service, but love is drawing that out of them, right? We'll get there too, but that's where they're ahead of us, to be functioning from that place. We're just learning to function from something besides, I, me, mine. There's a story in Daphne Charter's book about a Deva that he's been working with his plant. He loves it. And there's a slug that wants to come eat the plant, is headed right for it. And this Deva spends 20 minutes just concentrating on talking to the slug, and he's loving the slug, and the slug is loving him back. I guess slugs are loving too. And he's telling the slug, really, over here is some fine stuff. You don't want to eat this plant. This plant really doesn't need any eating, I can tell you. And after 20 minutes of concentration, the slug eats the plant anyway. So unfortunately, humans are rather like the slug when it comes to working with Devic suggestions. So when I mentioned the evolutionary path, that's not the only path there is. And that's a really important thing. When we get into these worlds, this gets into particularly deep esoteric concept, but to summarize, evolutionary is consciousness gradually freeing itself from the restrictions of matter. I mean, the confinements of human existence, our consciousness will eventually overcome. And even our need to be involved in dense matter like we are now, we're going to overcome that. That's the evolution of consciousness, to the point where we're functioning from higher and higher levels in full self-awareness and sovereignty and power over every level we've gotten past. That's the godlike aspect of our destiny. But there's another, there's involutionary. There's an involutionary flow where matter, instead of freeing itself from consciousness and little bits of matter that we ultimately are, freeing ourselves from all of our attachments and conglomerations and dense involvement in matter, this matter first has to get involved in matter. It's called the cosmic out-breath and in-breath, the involution into matter and evolution out of it. That the very most basic, tiny, primordial atoms of the cosmos take on ever more relationships with things, get involved in structures, and that's the involutionary path until they're finally so densely evolved in matter, have had so many experiences to get there, that they are ready for evolutionary development and freeing themselves from it. We can all be glad we're on the evolutionary path, but these involutionary forces are actually around us all the time. And some of the matter that we work with, emotional and mental matter, is actually involutionary matter. It has its own desire to have more intense emotions and greater powerful thoughts and get more involved in experience and deeper into matter. All of this material that's on the involutionary path down into matter makes its progress by being involved in the creations and bodies and forms of evolutionary beings. So as we experience and do things, we're giving all this matter experiences and bouncing things off of it. Emotional, like we created those giraffes like that. That's involutionary matter that has no choice but to immediately obey. It's not conscious in an active way. It's experiencing by being subjected to every single thing that it wants to be done with it. It experiences, learns, gradually has experiences. So the involutionary world has its own leadership, has its own purposes, and there's a very important distinction about what you find. When you go into the subtle worlds, start to acquire some ability there, you'll find the Devas, you find these beautiful nature spirits, ranging from the tiny little ones to something like human size, maybe that are called devas or angels, and then up to great, fantastic beings running entire planes of existence, But you'll also find involutionary beings, like that little giraffe thought form. That was a creation. That's not a being of its own. It's not an evolutionary being. It's an involutionary thing that's been created. So Laurency stresses that it's like a primary thing that the explorers of these inner worlds need to learn very much right away is what's actually an evolutionary being making choices, interacting with you, and what's actually constructed by somebody. Like if I was just reading David Spangler talking about visiting C.S. Lewis's grave to pay his respects in England. He admired his work. And as he was there by the grave, suddenly there C.S. Lewis appeared. Well, it wasn't him, of course. It was everybody's thought forms about him. All of the creations of people thinking and idolizing him and imagining him to how he would be. And they made a very beautiful portrait of him, you might say, but that appeared to be really him, but wasn't. And you can encounter a lot of those things in those worlds. The emotional world is filled with the creations of humans. Middle Earth. Everything we've imagined from Tolkien's writings, we've imagined it very well there. And you can go visit all the places because they've been so thoroughly contributed to by millions of people imagining these worlds. But likewise, there are beings. There are beings created with very specific intentions. And this is a kind of a surprising thing, that they're not evolutionary beings. They are creations, yet with some ability to use intelligence, endowed with some intelligence to fulfill a particular function. Like a powerful healer, like Daskalos, and I don't know if you've read any of his books, the healer from Cyprus. He would imagine up a being that would simply be with somebody and give them energy when they needed it, report back to him if that person was having a problem, and come back to him if they ran out of energy to get recharged. This being had a function, it would fulfill its job, and it's not an angel, it's not a deva, it's a creation. So I thought I'd spend a little time on the more difficult esoteric aspects of all of this, but that's something that we'll all have to figure out when we start getting awareness of these worlds, who the evolutionary beings are and what the constructed involutionary beings are. There are also other parallel evolutions on this planet, also in the subtler worlds. We're only allowed to know about the Devas. It's us and the Devic kingdom. There are 5 others. And just recently, David Spangler and others have talked about some that we may be becoming aware of from one of these other ones. The She, or Sidhe, of Irish and Scottish legends seem to be human like us. I mean, not dense like this, but etheric. But when you can work with the etheric, you could potentially meet these beings, and almost like distant relatives of ours. There's only relatively new information. It's not in the older Theosophical writings. I don't have much information about it. But because someone of David Spangler's, this I respect so much, was talking about it, I thought I'd bring it up. They are very concerned, these beings, about the state of the environment of the planet and want to help us wake up to what we're doing to it. So we may hear more about them in the future. The bird kingdom is actually closely allied with the Devic kingdom. I had read somewhere, but I couldn't find the quote, that birds, as they evolve through their kingdom, don't go into the human. Once they graduate from the animal, they go into the Devic kingdom. But I did find information mentioning how some devas contact people through the bird kingdom. Other devas prepare to incarnate as human with incarnations as birds first. And then devas that are in a passive existence, apparently that can be kind of like a passive long-term thing for some devas, when they'll take some bird incarnations before becoming fairies, because it anchors them in the physical world. And that brings up an interesting point that it's not an absolutely fixed line between the kingdoms. That an individual in the David kingdom can potentially incarnate in the human kingdom. And in some of the research I've read, such as Alice Bailey saying that we must remember likewise the fact that life of every degree, from a god to the most insignificant of the lesser devas or builders, must at some time or another pass through the human family. So my grandfather always talked about the devas. I'll tell you some of the stories that he told me later. But he mentioned that it was an initiatory step for devas. When they got to a certain point, they would incarnate as a human to completely flesh out their individualization. That it was so much easier to do as a human than as a deva. When you're connected as a deva, you're part of it all. To actually see yourself as a separate being with its own agenda can be difficult. As a human, we have no problem with that. That's all we do all day long, is see ourselves as separate beings. So that's actually could be beneficial to a deva. Also mentioned is that the really dedicated healers among the humans, that's what they're really all about. Most important to them is healing. That they will sometimes move on to the Devic evolution because that's where they can perfect their abilities to heal. The Devas are offering and trying and willing and present to help the healers of the world. If only we were more aware of them and could take more advantage of it. They actually are involved in a lot of the healing that does happen. When we actually are working with them consciously, healing will be possible that is completely unheard of in our current medical science. Another reason that a deva might incarnate as a human is because they fall in love with a human. That's possible. And they will sometimes go to great lengths to try to be human and have an incarnation as a human. And the ones that have incarnated for the first time as a human, Leadbeater talks about them being kind of irresponsible individuals who have a hard time focusing and are very sweet and lovely people. But they're very much not like other people. And I don't know how well it works out for them to be with the one they love, to incarnate for that reason. That's an interesting, I'd like to know more about those stories. So we're talking about Deva's relationships to humanity, and of course we have to bring up the scary stories that humanity seems to always have plenty of, about the evil fairies that did something awful to somebody somewhere. And a lot of this, in fact, according to David Spangler, just about everything that's bad that people run into in the subtler worlds is what we brought with us to the subtler worlds. And it's also ignorance. We need to know how those worlds work. We can't just go in there and expect to immediately be able to function with these fourth dimensional beings as the higher than physical, have another dimension to their existence. We very much think three-dimensionally here. As we struggle with all of that, it's hard to be absolutely safe. Like Bailey talks about in, I think it's Treatise on White Magic, how someone trying to create something really good, a white magician trying to create something, who doesn't properly protect himself at one step of the process, can end up getting involved with water devas in a very bad way where they remove all the water from his body. And he basically, or at least his emotional nature is completely dried out, removed from him. And that's his demise. And that she mentioned that several have perished that way from unwise experiments when they didn't really know quite what they were doing. But if you don't know what a busy road is about here and you just walk out into it, you're in great danger too. It's the same in any other world. You've got to get some help. Like David Spangler had his guide John for 27 years, helped him explore, learn, be safe, expand his abilities, and discarnate humans such as John are often involved in helping people get familiar with the Devic kingdom or with subtler worlds, as are Devas themselves sometimes interested in helping. So some more of the functions of the Devas relative to humanity. Well, I guess say a little bit more about the dark side of Devas. You know, there are beings, humans, ex-humans, you might say. They're not going to get any further than humans, but they have renounced their humanity to become black magicians, and it is their aim to retard all human progress, or they will lose their power, since their power depends on being able to control humans through their lower natures. And as soon as we raise our vibrations out of our lower natures into our higher natures, they can't control us anymore. They lose their power. Their goal is to keep us at a feudal level and divide and sow hatred and destruction every possible way. We're warned about this in the esoteric books, that such beings exist. They're not unopposed, certainly, or we've been all over for all of us long ago. They're very powerful, good forces at work. But these black magicians can, like they did in Atlantis, compel some kinds of the fairies, some of the lower devas, the smaller ones, in a few cases some of the red ones, they say. But not the yellow ones or the blue ones or the green ones. They just can't be controlled by them. But they can compel those beings to do their will, which can be to some selfish aim or wreak some destruction on their enemies of some kind. So, you know, that does explain some of the stories, the negative stories that we have about Devas. And they have free will, and the Devas can make mistakes, but from what I understand, their intentions are always good, unless, you know, dominated by some bad human. They have no ill will towards humans, as frustrated as they can get with us when we've destroyed one of their magical spots and seemingly unaware of the beauty of the world around us. They're involved in far more than we realize. Dora Van Gelder, in a really delightful book, The Real World of the Fairies, the last chapter of the book is about a hurricane. And the hurricane is coming toward Miami. And, you know, our meteorologists have their own view of how that all works, and the rising heat bringing up the moisture and the vortex. Well, from her perspective, there were great devas involved in all of this. And there was one specialist deva, the storm deva, for the entire hurricane, that coordinated all the activities of all the other devas and all the natural forces brought together. A really incredibly beautiful, imposing, intelligent and calm, surprisingly a calm being was the storm deva. And she described him, and it's just fascinating. He organized all, and he had some colleagues, the angel of life, the angel of death, that actually were there for when human life was actually to come under, to end for some people. They were there to make sure that it was aligned with the karmic, just balance of this person, you know, is expected on the soul level, is expecting this actually. On the soul level, we know what's coming our way from our karmic deeds, and so the devas work. In fact, it's the devas that are in charge of administering karma, the law of cause and effect, and sowing and reaping, called the Lipika Lords. They actually make sure the balance is struck in all respects. And they do it rather impersonally. If we've got it coming, we've got it coming. You know, they're not going to try to help somebody get out of something that really is actually has to be done for justice and balance and for our own progress. Another thing that they do, the devas, to determine which clans of humans are to incarnate. Interesting that it's the devas that decide that, but they're part of organizing everybody's evolutionary progress, and even the planetary hierarchy. You know, the people that have graduated from the human kingdom or supervising from higher levels, they've just got to work with what they get, the humans that come in. It's very rare that they have any say in who gets to incarnate. The good and bad forces at work in this world fighting each other over this and that, they all have to work with what we get, the souls that come in. And the devas have made their decisions about it. They inspire scientists. They can work with farmers. A farmer that's actually showing an intelligent interest in their seeds and their plants and wants to respect the life in them can get huge benefits from what the Devas can do for them. That's yet to come. There's so many wonderful cooperations, like in the healing I mentioned, and in our food supply. So much good is yet to come when we start cooperating and learning from them. The scientists. And many of our great scientific discoveries were inspired by Devas, who were trying to help, and the scientists never knew, but they provided the inspiration that did such a wonderful, helped with such a wonderful breakthrough. And they not only work on that level with humanity, they work very personally with each of us. They ensoul humanity. And I have a whole talk on that because it's one thing I never understood until I read Laurency. But there are Devas called Ogoides that are very advanced beings working from the level beyond the mental. Basically, once a being has reached this, they're called the Buddhic plane in Theosophy. It's world 46 according to Laurency. It's a world of perfect unity and love where everything is known through sharing and consciousness. That's our goal beyond human. When we're done being human, we're conscious there. These Devas, these great angels really, are already there. And they've been working with us, each of us individually has one of these Devas working with us and has been working with us for millions of years, for all the incarnations we've been going through. Ever since we made the jump from the animal kingdom and left the animal group soul and had our own soul, it's that being that provided the higher mental matter that is our soul, is a stand-in for our soul. And this is where it gets very complicated in the esoteric side of things. But basically, when we're sharing a body with a being like that, a body that provided for us, the causal body, higher mental, when we can wake up in that body, every experience we've had in all of our incarnations is going to be available to us. That's one of our goals, is to wake up as the causal selves that have all of our experiences. Until then, that great Deva is standing in for us in that consciousness and working in perfectly unified consciousness with everyone else's egoides, planning that these people should meet, or these people should, attracting people to each other for various purposes, helping to make sure that certain things happen for a person's, they work with destiny, very involved in that for each of us. They can protect us. They have all power in the three worlds, physical, emotional, mental, as they're called, the three worlds of human experience. They can do anything in those worlds. They don't particularly care about our day-to-day lives. That's up for us to learn from. They don't do anything for us that we can do for ourselves, but they do assist when they can. And they're waiting, and have been waiting for millions of years, for us to wake up to their presence. That's one of the really wonderful things we have to look forward to. And talk about a connection with the Deva kingdom, to know ourselves to be this great, powerful Deva. That's when people have the epiphany experiences, the great experiences where they share consciousness with everything. That's when their egoides has lifted them into that egoides level of consciousness briefly. And for me, it's only happened once in this lifetime, others many times, but it's not something you ever forget. And it gives me a lot of hope, because not only are you lifted, you realize it's been you all along. It's like, oh, now I remember everything about the unity of what I'm part of and what I really am. We just don't really know who we are until we can struggle here, we can try, and we can try to live as souls. It's one of the best things we can do to increase our speed in becoming that. But egoides has got incredibly beautiful plans for us at all times, is helping us manifest those plans to evolve. And if we can tune in enough and listen to that great advice and guidance, that's the fastest progress that we can make. These beings have put their own progress on hold to a degree in order to help us for all this time. It's a kind of sacrifice that we as humans probably can't imagine. So these beings in the Bailey books are called multiple things: angel, ego, solar angel, angel of the presence. Laurency says, in the esoteric literature, egoides has been given many different names: Agnishvata, Manasa Deva, Asura, Fire Dhyani, son of fire. Nirmanakaya, which is definitely not correct. Son of mind, solar god, solar angel, solar Petri, Adonai. It's hard to sort all this out of literature, so I really encourage you to read Laurency and find out what's really going on with the Gaudies. Whenever we try to contact divinity, that's what we contact. Our own divine devas working with us. That's our closest contact to divinity. Prayers, that's where they go. And whatever we ask for, we will eventually get, if it's allowed, if we've got the karmic circumstances to allow it. A Gaudies is happily making all these things we want happen so that we can learn about what we really want. So, many people are interested in contact with the Devas. So let's talk a little bit about that. I know people that are in contact with them pretty much continuously. I interviewed a couple of people. One person who not only in contact, but had a very powerful relationship with more than one Deva over the years. As intimate, this is a Deva being a human being, but the intimacy of mind and of love and of shared thoughts, and it's incredible to hear him tell this story. And he's very, she was the Deva. He says she was associated with an oak tree, and he was biking past this oak tree one day on a trail and felt this pull. But this is a pretty special individual who all his life had been able, since he was a child, was aware of the beings around him, but he felt this pull. And he thought about it all day, and he thought, okay, I'm willing to trust this being, go back and find out what's going on. And then he got to know her, and he would lay on the grass by this tree and share consciousness with her. And it was a beautiful experience for him for months, almost a year. And unfortunately, the tree was cut down. And the Deva had to move on. It doesn't kill the Deva, but they no longer had that kind of, for the Deva, that's its physical incarnation, is working with that tree. So it had to move on. And he's still very involved with a number of beings on those levels, and yet carries out life in this world. And from my own experience with these things, that's got to be difficult. And he said it has been challenging with him. He's had to learn how to keep from too many beings taking advantage of him, kind of working through him. He was just wide open, too wide open. If you've got all your doors and windows thrown wide open, things can come in that maybe we all have our boundaries that are natural, and he didn't particularly have those. So we can be grateful for those. So in trying to contact these beings, always make sure that you are giving permission, because they do ask for permission. And particularly, in very rare cases, there are beings that don't have your best interests in mind. You don't want to give them permission. Make sure you've checked that out before you do give them permission to share in your consciousness and in your life. So, I've talked to him, and also to Michael Pilarski, who lives in Port Townsend, where I live, and founded the Fairy Human Relations Congress that meets every year. I think it's out towards TWISP, and maybe 300 people or so will show up. And according to my other friend who can see them, lots of Devas come along too. So if you're particularly interested, that might be a place you can have some encounters. You'd be with a lot of other people who have objective awareness of them. And Michael and this other friend of mine agree that to contact the Devas, you meet them halfway. They can't simply just say, okay, I'm going to make myself visible to that person. It's you wanting to reach out to them and them wanting to reach out to you. If both of those are present, and you can raise your vibration. There's a vibration, not just raising, but tuning to be able to see them. David Spangler talks about that you've really got to tune to the right vibration. Even discarnate humans have a process to go through to tune to the vibration to see the Devas in the worlds that are shared with them. So being in nature is going to help. Nature is very important to them. They're much more comfortable there, though there are house fairies that want to live in the house too. The perception, it's so easy to color it with your own perception. So our expectations have a lot to do with it. If at all possible, the thing to do is leave our own expectations out of it, leave projections from fairy stories that we've read out of it, because they're just going to influence what we see too much. I've heard that they can't be seen through glass. I haven't read that anywhere, but I've heard that from others, and that's kind of interesting because ultraviolet light doesn't penetrate through glass very well. That's a higher frequency of light than we can see, so maybe, there's something related there. I've had some other contacts myself. Only one time did I actually see a human fairy, human-like fairy. It wasn't on human, obviously, but in that form. I flew into the room I was in, and there it was over there by the wall. I looked at it for a minute in complete awe, and then it flew out, and I can't deny the experience. Once that's happened, I know they're real. And there were times when my ability to see them was a little better, and I was aware of, in almost any situation, if you're aware of them, they're particularly interested in you, and I could feel the little eyes turned my way and almost see them. And at one particular point where I was more able to see than others, they would bring me beings to see, like a giant cuttlefish that filled the room, a beautiful rainbow-colored cuttlefish that for some reason, I don't know why they brought it, or if it came, it wanted me to see it. Just the fact that I could see it, I think, meant something to it. Another time, a big starfish. I guess I'm tuned into the sea, but I have a little theory about that the etheric sea, we've got obviously our physical sea, but the etheric sea may have a higher sea level. And that we could be actually underwater in the etheric sea right now with etheric cuttlefish swimming right around us. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. I didn't read that in a book anywhere, so. I mentioned in my last talk about esoteric science that there are a number of places in the books where they predict that humanity's next big development is to open up etheric vision across the board, across all of humanity. And in fact, they hesitated a long time before releasing all the information that Theosophy and Bailey have put out there for us. A number of the planetary hierarchy who had to make the decision about releasing that information and ending the lockout since Atlantis, they thought it'd be better to wait until the vanguard of humanity had etheric vision and could verify some of this for themselves. But a couple of them insisted that we cannot let humanity suffer in the dark any longer. We've got to give them this information. We can't. Let's do it. Let's try it. Let's hope it works. And we'll take the responsibility on ourselves. And those are who we know as the masters Moria and Kuthumi. They took that responsibility, and thank goodness they did, or we wouldn't have any of this great information. We wouldn't be talking about any of this. We'd still be waiting for humanity to increase its vibration enough to all have etheric vision, or a significant portion. But it is coming. And it's also predicted in the esoteric books that the ability to photograph those worlds is coming. That's going to make a big difference. And I suspect it's already happening, and no one quite believes what they're seeing on the video. Apparently photographic film doesn't capture it, but the video might. So talking about experiences, I was very fortunate to have grandparents who, they were the authors of the Rainbow Bridge books. My grandfather was my first spiritual teacher, and he and Josephine, Norman and Josephine Stevens, were very aware of the Devas. She had excellent clairvoyant abilities, objective abilities to see etheric and emotional material, and they observed some very interesting things. I was fascinated by the stories, and one of them was that the San Onofre nuclear power plant in Southern California, I think it's near Oceanside, there was an enormous deva, a very advanced, like master deva that basically lived there and that had a human incarnation and could therefore speak to them mind to mind. And they were able to talk to it, and they asked it what it was doing there. And he said that the humans who are releasing this atomic energy here don't really know what they're doing. There's a lot more going on than they're aware of. There's an excess of energy that if this deva wasn't here to soak it up, there would be big problems. And he was there, as devas do. They work with energy. He was working with it. He's transmuting. I don't know what he did. And maybe Norman asked, but he never told me. But every 50 miles or so, they said there's a great big ocean deva there that's coordinating the activities of devas for many miles around. They also traveled around California, up the coast, and talked about seeing a great deva for every volcano. And they tried to draw some of those, and that was interesting. There was one volcano that they didn't go anywhere near because that deva was agitated. And this was in the 70s, so I suspect that was Mount St. Helens, which blew its top, and I think it was 81, right? So it's a good thing they didn't go. They talked about every California mission that they visited, that the Junipero Serra and the early friars who had founded them actually had a bit more going on than people knew about, and had worked with the deva to be anchored there for their mission. And that no one had thought about it for 200 years. But when they got there, it's like the material of reassemblance in an angelic form at every one of these missions. It is like a film over the ground of material, and they said it reassembled, which makes me wonder if it was a deva or an involutionary form that was created, and I never got clarity from them on that. They said that also happened at the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, that when they got there, a big golden form of an angel blowing its trumpet assembled atop the temple, where there already is a golden statue of an angel blowing a trumpet. But they said there was an actual angelic form that went with that. And it's one of the prophecies in the church there that when that angel appears, the end times are nigh. Well, the angel appeared for Norman and Josephine. They talked about the heavenly bride, that the Davidic kingdom is feminine, to the human kingdom's masculine, and that the heavenly bride was a symbolic name for the Davidic kingdom, and that when we reach the point where both we can be aware of each other again, this tremendous balancing will occur, and that the masculine energy has run amok in the human kingdom, and that's part of the reason that we don't have this natural balance with the Davidic kingdom going on. And of course, that's probably typical of the masculine thinking, to think it can do everything and be completely unaware of how much help it's getting from the feminine. Because the Davidic kingdom is right here, right now, working with us and helping us anyway. We're just not aware of it. And they said that in 1975, there was a great convocation that happens every year. On the 75s of the centuries are particularly important get-togethers of the planetary leadership. And for the first time, the heads of the Davidic hierarchy attended with the heads of the human hierarchy. And the agreement was made that it was time to start reconnecting and making aware of each other. But that's probably a slow process that's only beginning, trying, like I said, there is danger to it happening too quickly. So I think they're trying to make it happen in a safe way. There's just one more thing I have to mention about observations. The crop circles. No one can convince me that some drunk guys at a pub decided to go out there with some boards and a rope and make these incredibly elaborate geometric forms out in the fields in the middle of the night. Yeah. This is so far beyond. And humans, when humans carve their initials and things, they don't make incredibly beautiful geometric forms like that. And David Lee Bladen, who wrote the book Science and Spirituality, which is a very good book, I think, he claims that it's the nature spirits. They're at play and they're having fun and they think it's a wonderful thing. They have abilities that we don't have, like bending a blade, a wheat shaft, just bending it like it's been melted. We can't do that. We can break them, we can crimp them, but we don't have a way to just have it like melt over so that all these wheat stalks bend over to make these forms. And it's not just wheat. I went on a website recently. There's a crop circle in snow and ice on a peninsula off of someplace in China where no human goes. There are no footprints around this, but it's a really elaborate crop circle with geometric patterns in it and shapes and forms. It's just incredible. Life is showing up on the other side of the world, and it's pretty hard for me to conceive that some human decided they're going to, somehow do it from a helicopter. Anyway, I just had to throw that out there. That may be nature spirits giving us some indication of their artistic ability. So, as I prepared for this talk, I was concerned that I was choosing an escape. And I rather intentionally turned off the news for myself, reading about Donald Trump's latest crazy stuff. And I suppose it was an escape in a way, but when I realized how much hope and love and healing and support is in potential for us here with the Davidic kingdom, that's kind of the answer to all the craziness. And I'm really looking forward to us connecting with it. I'd just like to wrap up by saying that when you have 200 billion creatures living all around us in a spirit of love and service and beauty, and we're unaware of it, it shows that there is a great potential ahead for us all in that connection, and that it's yet another reason not to worry too much about all the nonsense we see out there in the world. There are things that scientists and politicians and pundits know nothing of that are yet to make an appearance and change things dramatically, such as our ability to contact the etheric Devas, which is probably coming soon. So that's my talk, and I can answer questions if anybody has any. There's some time left.